here today with Senator Andy Manar, who represents the 48th District in the Illinois Senate. He is seeking re-election in the November 6th general election. We appreciate you coming here to talk to us today about the issues facing the district. And if you'd like to kick off with just an opening statement on why voters should give you another term.
Sure. Thanks for having me again. This would be my third time as a candidate in front of the editorial board, multiple times, I guess, as a member of the Senate since I was given the privilege to represent the 48th District. So let me start here. I've spent my time in the state Senate over the past 6 years working on reform from large, incredibly complex issues like school funding in Illinois to things that maybe didn't get as much attention around the state. Certainly got attention here at the State Journal Register, but things like the Truth in Hiring Act, which I worked with Comptroller Mendoza on, and other transparency measures. Those things, I would say from one end to the other, I think best describe my time in the state Senate, that I've been given the privilege to serve in the body. That's something that I like to do every day. I like to challenge state government. I like to propose questions that haven't been asked, maybe in years in many cases, but I think that's important moving forward as well. I can point to any number of issues where we've been successful for Springfield, from protecting and growing the SIU School of Medicine to passing a legislation that I sponsored to separate out the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, to back pay, to keeping the State Museum open. There's any number of things that are specific to Springfield, but it has truly been my privilege to serve this wonderful city, the capital city in the state Senate, as well as the 48th District. As you three know, the 48th District on its face could elect a Democrat or Republican, and that is something that has not gone lost on me a single day in the job. So I try to be a voice of reason, and that's what I hope to continue to do in the state Senate if given the privilege to serve for another 4 years.
You mentioned what the reforms you've looked at, and we'll start with education funding reform. It's something that's been sought after for years in the state. Certainly you championed it during your terms in the Senate. Reform happened last year. As one of the leaders of this reform, how would you categorize the first year it's been implemented?
So I think it's been overly successful. I could give you any number of circumstances that I could point to around the state that even many that you've reported on, how equity injected into an inequitable system is producing results for children. Eventually that's going to produce higher achievement, which was the whole goal, was to have a public school system that is more equitable, that by extension will produce higher achievement for students in Illinois. So there literally isn't a day that goes by where I don't have a call or an email from an administrator, a parent, or a teacher somewhere in Illinois that gives me a story about what that complicated piece of legislation has produced for them. And that's not to say it's not without its challenges still. We have major challenges ahead when it comes to school funding. But having spent 5 years on that process, it was something I started. I think I was sworn in for all of probably 6 weeks when I filed the first legislative measure in the Senate. And I remember people on the Senate floor said, this is foolish. This is, we're going down a path that is never going to produce what has been sought after. But we kept at it. We built a bipartisan coalition. We built a statewide coalition in a diverse state where geography tends to divide us very clearly. And we overcame those challenges. And as a result, we have what is now considered a model system for the rest of the country. And I'm very proud of that. I don't take credit for it singularly. It was a group, it was a coalition, but that's how you get things done in Illinois.
You said challenges remain for it. What are those challenges?
Well, I think number one, the teacher shortage, I think is a major challenge for our state. It is more profound in some parts of the state than others. It's non-existent in some parts of the state. Mirrors the same challenges with equity. Inequity is not an issue in some parts of Illinois. It's overly egregious in other parts. Same with teacher shortage. But we're not just going to wish it away. We have to proactively address it. And that comes with controversy. And we could talk about that bill as well that the governor vetoed. So I think that's number one challenge. I think, but by the way, I think we can solve that challenge too, because having school funding reform done, that makes these other conversations a little easier than otherwise they would have been. I think we have to implement property tax relief in the state. Again, now that we have school funding reform done, that should be a conversation that, frankly, Democrats ought to embrace, because as we address that issue, that also helps speed up the bridge to having a more equitable system of school funding in the state too. And that's something that I've been quietly critical of my own party of, for not embracing that more in a more robust way, frankly. So that's number two. And I think number three is just the basic, how are we going to pay for it? That was always a hurdle that we had to get over when we were having debate on the bill and discussions. But as I reminded my colleagues on both sides of the aisle down the street, if we had just invested what we had invested in the previous years in a system that was more equitable, we would have been so far better off. So we will find the resources. To the credit of the governor and the legislature this year, there was literally no debate on that, and that is a world of change from where we were just here a year ago or 2 years ago, where the suburbs wanted this pot of money, downstaters wanted this pot of money, the city of Chicago wanted this pot of money. This year, everyone agreed with very little, if any, debate that we should just fund year 2 of the program.
You're talking making sure there was the additional $350 million.
Yes, 350. Yeah. So I think it's teacher shortage, property tax relief, and continuing the path, the trek toward equity by investing more.
Going back to the teacher shortage and the legislation that Governor Manar vetoed that would have set the minimum salary for a teacher at $40,000 a year. You've said you're going to seek an override to that veto. I'm going to play devil's advocate with you and say that this should be a local decision, what teachers are paid, that this should be the decision between the local union and school board. Tell me what you think differently.
Well, first of all, I think the bill we passed was reasonable. So a couple of things. It was delayed a year, so it doesn't take into effect until the 2019-2020 school year. It starts at $32,000 and then works its way up over time to $40,000, which was a hard sell to the proponents of the measure. But I would say this, Kate. I would say that if we were dealing with anything but what I believe is a full-fledged crisis, I would say that argument would carry more weight. Not that it isn't a credible argument, because that is a tough balance, right? Mm-hmm. Local control versus statewide policy. We wrestle with that all the time. But in this case, there is a crisis on our hands. I could show you statistics that would boggle your mind about how few individuals, young people, talented, bright young people, children of teachers, whose parents are saying, don't go into the profession of teachers telling their children, don't do it. Why? Wages, work conditions. You get blamed for all the bad. You get credit for none of the good. And this idea came to me first and foremost from teachers that I represent. I had a series of meetings from actually immediately after the governor signed Senate Bill 1947 about a year ago this week in Chicago. I started a series of meetings with teachers, private meetings with groups, large groups, small groups, and I said, you tell me what we can do as policymakers to change this problem. This was number one. So I don't think $32,000 is an egregious amount of money for the responsibility that we heap on the backs of teachers. We delayed it a year, by the way, because it's my goal to try to update the formula so that we can drive money to districts to bridge that gap. This will boost the profession. I think it's reasonable. And I wouldn't be proposing the legislation if I wasn't fully convinced just by the conversations that I have with the folks that do this every day that we have a crisis on our hands in our state.
How common is it for teachers to be making less than $32,000?
It's more common than what I think most realize, and that was kind of the first question I asked. And I could give you instances where there are teachers, oftentimes single parents, that have been teaching for well into their tenure, who make below the federal poverty level. And, that's rare, but it does happen in Illinois. And we should that shouldn't be the case. It should not be the case. And I recognize that this has to be balanced with the element of local control. We have 865 school districts in the state. Each has an elected board. Each makes local decisions. But that has to also be balanced with what I believe is it's a train wreck happening right in front of us right now. You can't find PE teachers. How do you expect to find calculus teachers and advanced placement courses? Teachers that can be teaching community college level classes so that we have a ready workforce, and that so that kids can graduate high school with credits under their belt, so they don't have to accrue debt, when they go to college or go to a trade school or something. So I think all the reasons point toward why this is a reasonable step. And so, I'm also can count votes, and I know that we're going to have to convince folks of that, and that's what I'm doing right now, is trying to build that coalition to override the governor's veto. I would mention this too, not to talk too much about this one, but the governor referenced in his veto message a statewide salary schedule. There isn't one, by the way. So the governor didn't provide. I have respect for opposing opinions. That's what we do. But the governor didn't provide in his veto message a clear reason not to do this. He pointed to a statewide salary schedule. There isn't such a thing. I have no idea what he was talking about there. And he did not even begin to acknowledge, again, what is the situation today, which is the lack of applicants to fill the thousands of vacant classrooms that exist today in the state.
Kind of staying on the education aspect there, would you be in favor of shifting pensions for public school teachers to the local school districts?
My default position is no.
Why?
Because it would reverse gains we've made to achieve a more equitable system.
But my argument here is they're not state employees, so why is the state paying their pensions?
That's a valid question. So here's my test. My test is, if there's a proposal that doesn't go counter to what it took us 5 years to accomplish, then it should be given a fair debate in the House and the Senate.
Okay.
And I've seen those, by the way. They do exist. But the governor's proposal that was in his budget in February of this year for this calendar year, for this fiscal year, would wipe out the first 2 years of gains that we fought so hard for. So we can't do that. If there's another way to do it, then I have an open mind.
Okay.
Real quickly before we move off education, just with teacher shortage, aside from the salary, what else can be done legislatively, to address some of the problems?
Yeah, so we've I would point to there was a bill that I sponsored in the Senate that was passed in May that contained three pretty large pieces, the biggest of which was reciprocity to other states. So there was, again, this came to me from meetings I had with teachers. There was a particular example that got me on this where I was talking to Dr. Frigo in Decatur, and he was hired a teacher was given a provisional license in Illinois. This particular teacher had taught for almost 2 decades in another state, and because she couldn't produce, she produced her transcripts from college from about 20 years ago, but because she couldn't produce the course description of a particular class, she was denied an Illinois license, even though she was a successful teacher by all accounts. I don't remember the state. I think it was Iowa, actually. That was true. So we passed, it was tough. You have to bring teachers' unions, administrators together, State Board of Education bureaucracy, and you have to say, this has to change. We have a shortage. There's no reason why a successful teacher that's licensed and has the appropriate schooling shouldn't be almost immediately licensed in Illinois. So we passed that. That was a big, big change. We also streamlined some issues dealing with how substitute licenses are issued, as well as the ability of retired teachers to come back and teach part-time without affecting their pension or the pension system. So I described that, Angie, that's kind of low-hanging fruit. Mm-hmm. So those are Band-Aids. Those things have a small positive impact, but we have to change the course that we're on. When you look at the lack of students enrolling in schools of education at ISU or SIU or any of the private universities, it's stunning. It is stunning in Illinois. And I think that's why I think that minimum salary bill is so important.
In general, we would argue as an edit board that the biggest issue facing our state is the unfunded pension liability. How would you propose we address that liability, which is about at least $130 billion?
Yep.
Is the figure you hear thrown out most often.
Yeah, I think the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability has credible proposals that they've produced that would refinance that pension debt without adding to what already is an unmanageable amount of unfunded liability. So I think, again, I keep using the word reasonable, but I think many, not all of them, but I think many of their proposals that they're crafting today, that they're meeting with lawmakers on, are reasonable things that we should debate. I think also that if there's any changes to the benefit structure, that obviously has to be prospective in nature, and that's based on a very strong ruling from the Supreme Court, as well as the ability to gather consensus among 59 members of the Senate and 118 members of the House. So I think those two things would be the place where I would start.
I mean, you talk about prospective benefit changes.
Yeah.
What kinds of things would be acceptable to you to put on that table?
Well, the first thing I would do is I would sit down with representation of the employees, first of all. If you rewind the clock back to, I believe it was 2013, there was a pension reform bill that the Senate passed that the House did not take up that was fully negotiated by the Senate with employee representation, union leadership. That was never taken up by the House. So the idea that you can't sit down and have a conversation with the individuals that would be affected by changes it's complete nonsense. It just doesn't happen enough. Certainly not under Governor Rauner. That hasn't happened at all. They don't even sit down across the table and talk about a contract. So that's where you have to start. That's where you have to start. So if those conversations happen and they're honest and they're open and it's a negotiation, I think that's the only way. That's the only way that you can move forward. Unilateral decisions on the part of the legislature, they just don't work. They don't work legally, as we've seen, and it doesn't work in terms of the necessity to have 30 votes and 60 votes to pass a bill. Plus, it's wrong. I would tell you that too. Is you got to talk to people.
The state's finances in general are in rough shape, have been for some time. We will argue the state's probably never truly had a balanced budget through the time. Your campaign website said the state needs to take an honest approach to budgeting. So explain to us what you mean by that and how you would work to change the financial trajectory of the state.
So I'm always operating under the premise that more information is better, more transparency is better, even when if it's a tough dose of medicine. I did that when I was in local government. I would argue that I still have some sour relationships because of the transparency I put in place in county government, and that was many years ago. So I would give a tip of the hat to the comptroller for her work. I think she has done incredible work to make sure that there is an honest and open picture about the state's finances that then decisions can be based from. One example, Debt Transparency Act that I sponsored in the Senate, there was a situation where even lawmakers didn't have an accurate picture of the number of bills that were being held at agencies at the direction of the governor's office, hundreds of millions of dollars of bills at the Department of Corrections, for example. So I think in order to make good decisions, you have to have good information. We didn't have it. We have better information now with the passage of that bill. But I think there's other things we can do. The other thing I've tried to do as an appropriations chair in the Senate, I'm the only downstater, I think, of any budget chair in the House and the Senate, which I'm proud of, is we have, I know this doesn't get a whole lot of coverage, but we have hours and hours of open meetings. There's no closed meetings. We ask tough, probing questions of agency directors and of individuals who are in charge with spending taxpayer dollars. and we're going to continue to do that. There are no easy decisions. There are no easy fixes. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there's a magic wand that anybody can wave to fix the problem, but I do know this. I do know that transparency is always better, and the dialogue that I've tried to put in place as an appropriation chair in the Senate in the very short time I've had that role, I believe helped lead to the process that was in place this year, which was in stark contrast to the previous three.
I guess elaborate what you mean on that, how the contract just.
Yeah, I actually make it a point to talk to the Republican members of the committee and the minority spokes people in both of the Senate Appropriations Committees. So when you build that framework during the course of several months of public hearings, and you give the minority, in this case, the opportunity to ask their questions, you give them as much time as the majority to either compliment or criticize how money's being spent. Then when it comes time to put all the pieces together, you have a nice framework of a positive conversation in public. And that was missing. It was missing for years. I'm not the only person that does that, by the way. It just that's something that I take very seriously. And it doesn't fit nicely on a campaign flyer, right? But it helps produce a better result, I think.
Do you think this year's budget is a good budget?
I do, yeah. It's perfect. It's not perfect.
It's about $1 billion under,
Well,
billion unbalanced, I thought was the last number I saw.
Well, every budget is revenues and expenditures.
Yeah.
They're estimates. They're both
Yeah.
estimates. We were very conservative on revenue estimates. So if revenue estimates come in higher than what we estimated, then that's money to the good. We clearly had some things that were unanswered, one of which is step increases that have to be paid. Keep in mind, should have been paid. This is just another one of those massive bills that gets bigger over time because of the inaction on the part of the governor for not being able to sit across the table from state employees and talk about this. So we have to pay for that, but that wasn't ready to be paid. Mm-hmm. It had not been finalized. It was not complete. We're very nearing that point now. So we acknowledge that. That was acknowledged on the debate on the floor of the Senate and the House. But beyond that, budgets are not they're not a one-day proposition. They have to be managed. There has to be discipline injected into the process. And revenues have to be monitored and expenditures have to be monitored. I would tell you that over the last 4 years, that hasn't happened. That hasn't happened at all. When you have agencies spending money on things that the legislature didn't authorize, number one, it's not legal. And number two, that's why we have such a ballooning number of unpaid bills. So that management aspect just has never entered into the equation with the Rauner administration. So our job is to pass budgets that are negotiated with the executive branch, that the governor can sign, which he did this year. It's their job to manage those things. And if it becomes unmanageable, then they come back to us and say, hey, folks, this is unmanageable. Let's fix it. We should fix it. But that management aspect just has never been there under the Rauner administration. When you look at the number of things that have been privatized in state government that, by the way, send jobs out of Springfield to some other state, and in so many cases, it's about profit making. It's not about making government more efficient and provide a better service and product for people. That's not management. That's not good management at all. And it spikes spending, which we don't need today.
Wouldn't it be fair to say, though, that it hasn't been managed for decades, sure, not just the last 4 years?
Yep.
I mean, we've been upside down in almost every budget that we've looked at,
well,
going back to the 70s.
Well, the previous administration, I think would disagree with that. The Quinn administration made every pension payment down to the dollar. The number of unpaid bills, of course, spiked and then came down to a very manageable level. Revenue was coming into state government. That was a couple of years where I would be hard-pressed to point to any large new program that was created. 2 of those years, of course, were before I was a member of the Senate. But it wasn't perfect, right? I mean, and I would acknowledge Governor Rauner wasn't given a perfect scenario. Nobody can credibly claim that. And that's not a political statement I just made. It's just a fact, in my opinion. So, but we took a situation that was really bad, that was starting to get better, and under the Rauner administration, it's just turned into a great big dumpster fire. And that's because he leads with division. It's divide and conquer. It's not consensus building. It's a different approach, and that's why in my opinion, that's why it's gotten worse.
The Democratic candidate for governor, J.B. Pritzker, would like to institute a graduated income tax for this state. Share with us what you think about that idea.
I support that.
Okay.
I do. The first thing that has to happen is, and this is the only way it can be done, is if the voters of the state approve a change to the Constitution, rightfully so.
I think one of the struggles people like our
Yep.
editorial board have is there are very few details in
Yeah.
what this would be. So what would you need to see? Like, what do you need to see? Brackets? Do you need to see income levels of what this is going to be? Because if he says, I'm going to tax the wealthy, wealthy is in the eye of the beholder. You and
Yeah,
I might
of
have
course
very
it is.
different
Right.
definitions of what wealthy
Yeah.
is.
Well, we have a relatively decent snapshot from 2014, where the 48 Senate District overwhelmingly approved the millionaire surcharge. So there's a little basis of how voters feel about asking those that have done quite well in this very difficult economy to chip in a little more so that we can right the ship in Illinois. But to me, there's been a couple proposals where that I've seen where current tax rates would go up, and then the progressive nature of having the wealthy pay more would be implemented by instituting a series of credits. I think that's just riddled with peril. I don't believe that's a good move. There would be a whole bunch of folks that disagree with me on that, but I just don't think that's a good move. I think this should be a straight-up question to the voters of the state, and if voters, rightfully so, decide to change the Constitution, then we can have the conversation about what does that mean. That's going to be just for the reasons you just outlined, Kate. That's going to be a tough question because the ambiguity of it obviously leads to a whole bunch of political landmines. But there's been any number of snapshots of other states and other states that have a tax code that isn't built like ours, that if we had the tax code of Iowa or Wisconsin, we'd have lower property taxes and we wouldn't have the deficit that we have today.
When you look at something like that, just ballpark, when you're thinking wealthy or middle class, throw out some numbers for us on where you might like to see.
Yeah, so I would just go back to 2014, and that's where I would start. That was a straight-up question to voters of the state, and I think there were only a small handful of counties that didn't approve it, and those that didn't, it was just by a very small margin. So to me, a surcharge on the income of millionaires to go to specific purposes of education equity and property tax relief, that is something that I think a vast majority of people in the state would support. No new but there has to be a very clear position stated that this isn't to spend money on stuff, right? It's to do what we need to do desperately in Illinois.
I think something else we hear a lot thrown out this election is term limits. Would you be of support of term limits?
No, I don't. And here's why. First of all, I recognize that I recognize the political consequences of this, but I don't pander to voters. I don't do that. Two reasons. Number one, if there are term limits implemented, in other states they're quite short, that empowers lobbyists and it empowers legislative staff, neither of which are accountable to voters. So the continuity of government lies in the hands of people who aren't directly elected by voters, number one. Number two, as a downstater, frankly, I don't know why any downstater would, because in the legislature, downstate members gain, I think, they gain what voters want them to gain: seniority, influential positions as a committee chair through tenure, because there's not as many downstaters as there are members from the northern part of the state. So, that would immediately guarantee that there would be no leadership from downstate Illinois. And I don't say that for any other reason than I like balance. I like balance, and it would tilt political influence even more toward the northern part of the state, in my opinion. That's not a good thing. But number three, I think the Senate took an appropriate step, and I did support this, and I pushed for it. In 2017, the first measure we voted on after the new General Assembly was sworn in, after the 2016 election, was term limits on leadership in both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party equally. And that was pushed by rank and file members of the Senate. I'm proud to be one of those folks that said, I want our rules amended to implement term limits on leadership. And when we started that process, everyone said that's never going to happen. It did happen, and it's the law in the Senate today, and the Senate is better because of it.
There's the argument, of course, that voters are the ultimate term limit.
Yep.
But we all know that there are serious questions in the state about how legislative districts are drawn.
Yep.
And maintained, for political considerations as opposed to others.
Yeah.
What, if anything, do you support in terms of redistricting and changing that process?
So
How it happens?
I support, I would say, most of the fair map proposal. There's one particular piece that I have concern with, and it deals with utilizing municipal boundaries as a basis for drawing or determining where legislative district lines go, because I think that has an adverse impact, and it's contrary to the Voting Rights Act in the state. I think the effect of that would be contrary to the Voting Rights Act, and I'm not for that. But should we change the process? We should absolutely change the process in the state, without question in my mind. It should be more balanced in terms of the responsibility. It should have more public input. The criteria, other than case law that can't be changed, should be changed so it's less political. I think that would, even though it's a once-in-a-decade proposition, I think it would go a long way for reforming government, which I support.
We appreciate you coming today,
Sure.
Andy, to talk with us. And we invite you to give a closing statement, your elevator pitch,
Sure.
as it were, to why you should be the victor on election night.
Sure. Thanks for having me. That went by pretty quick, actually.
It did.
I want to mention a couple things. Back pay was important. Obviously, that's important to Springfield and Sangamon County. It was something that we passed originally in 2016. Governor vetoed, but then, of course, he signed it this year. I was a proud sponsor of that. I mentioned the State Museum, which is another bill that I sponsored. Representative Jimenez and I worked on the bill this year that makes Springfield, rightfully so, the preference for state job creation. I was a proud, loud voice for the University of Illinois to invest and innovate Springfield. That was something that I worked on for about a year. Of course, the School of Medicine is an economic driver here. The Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum Bill, which is a bill that I'm very proud of. I think that's helping the museum out. I think we still have challenges there, but it's a good help. And of course, District 186 is a proud accomplishment. So I mention those things because in the 48th District, it's a diverse place, and I try to serve every community as best as I can. That usually involves challenging the status quo, which I don't mind doing. And I hope that voters give me the opportunity to do that for 4 more years.
Thanks for coming today.